From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me is Agi Legutko, Instructor of Yiddish at Columbia University. In the first part of our conversation, we talk about her journey to uncover her Jewish roots, the Yiddish language past and present, and her work on the Yiddish New York project, which maps the use of the Yiddish language in New York City. Here's my conversation with Agi Legutko. Professor Agi Legutko, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Okay, so you teach Yiddish here at Columbia, and you've been here for about 10 years or so, is that right?
9.
9 years, okay. And you originally are from Poland, is that correct?
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about the kind of linguistic situation that you encountered as you were growing up?
So I was born and raised in Poland. I grew up speaking Polish. I learned Russian and French in elementary school. I was growing up still in communist Poland, which meant that we all had to learn Russian for the most of elementary school. And then so my linguistic biography is a little scattered, because then I started learning English, sort of on the side, one might say. And in high school, I took English and German. And when I was applying to high school, I already wrote in my application letter, which I found some years ago, that I want to study English philology. So I already knew at the age of 15 that I'm going to study English. So I studied English at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. I was majoring in translation studies and language pedagogy. I had this sort of double specialization. And as I was in college, I became a tour guide to the Jewish quarter of Krakow. I was giving tours mostly in English to mostly American Jews or English-speaking Jews coming to Poland. This is mid-90s, late 90s, early 2000s. And this was also the time when I discovered Isaac Bashevis Singer and his writing. He was translated into Polish, and I read his stories in Polish, and I was just fascinated by them. And this was also the time, so sort of like three things were happening at the same time. I was studying English, I was a tour guide to the Jewish quarter of Krakow, reading Bashevis Singer, and this was the time when I discovered that I was Jewish myself. I didn't grow up Jewish. I didn't know that I was Jewish until in my early 20s.
Wow.
So this was sort of like a major transformative moment in my life, because, like complete identity change. You're not who you thought you were.
Right.
And sort of this Jewish-Yiddish connection was becoming very prominent in my life and in my identity, because just a little bit of Polish history. Under communism, Jewish history was not really taught in public schools, and the version of history was sort of distorted. And I went to high school right after communism ended. And I was surprised when I was doing the tour guiding course that there was this incredibly rich Jewish history of my hometown I was not aware of completely. So I wanted to sort of learn more about it, and I loved learning about history and literature and culture. This was all new to me, and I felt I was in a way deprived of knowing this important part of my identity, not only as a Jewish person, but as a Pole. So like Jewish history is an inherent part of Polish identity. Yeah. And, it's a long and complex history. So I decided when I'm in college, and I decided to write my master thesis about Bashevis Singer and about translation, because these were my two sort of focal points. And this is when I started learning Yiddish, because I wanted to read Bashevis in the original. I was fascinated by the fact that there are Polish words that entered Yiddish, and then from Yiddish were translated into English, right, in case of Bashevis's stories, and then from English were translated into Polish. So I sort of was very curious about the journey that Polish words made, right, from Polish through Yiddish, English, back to Polish. Words like rogatkę, oblote, spódnice, right? These are all sort of Polish words that entered Yiddish. And because I had German in high school for 4 years, I remember going to my first Yiddish class, And I was like, oh my goodness, I understand almost everything.
Wow. Yeah, yeah.
And I could speak, like a little broken, because German is sort of like this, gives you this sense of false confidence that you can actually speak. Not really. And I remember my first Yiddish teacher, who is no longer with us, said to me, if you want to speak good Yiddish, you have to forget your German. Which was interesting because there are so many similarities. And I was like, okay. I did not forget my German, but Yiddish has become my dominant language in terms of sort of Germanic languages. So this was a long answer to your question about my linguistic biography. So Polish, my mother tongue, learned Russian and French in school and was pretty fluent. Learned German and English intensely in high school, studied English for 5 years. And I lived in London for a year also because I wanted to be, native-like, because this was one of the criteria at my university. Started learning Yiddish. Learning Yiddish made me realize that there is this incredibly rich world of Yiddish literature and culture that hasn't been really explored. Mm-hmm. Only 5% of Yiddish literature has been translated into other languages. So this is really like this unexplored territory waiting for researchers. And I was thinking, like, how many more people do we need to write about Shakespeare? Because I was graduating from English philology department. And here you have, all these amazing writers. So this is how I ended up at Columbia. So I came here, did my PhD in Yiddish studies, and Columbia and New York are sort of the best places to do that because New York is such a Yiddish city. It's a place where Yiddish still is spoken in everyday life. It has a sizable Jewish population. There are so many Jewish and Yiddish-related institutions here, archives, and Jewish Yiddish culture flourishing here. So it's really the place to study Yiddish. But when I really started getting deeper into Yiddish, I realized that I also need to know Hebrew because Yiddish is what one of the famous Yiddish linguists called it. It's a fusion language. Yiddish has about 70% of the vocabulary is German.
Right, yeah.
About 15% Hebrew Aramaic, which is referred to as Lashon Kodesh, like the holy tongue, because this was the language in which Torah and Talmud, the commentaries, were written, and about 15% of Slavic languages, so Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, depending on which dialect you're talking about. So when I came to Columbia, I started learning Hebrew, and I learned a little bit of Spanish when I was here because I would realize that this is sort of a bilingual place, which also was something I did not know. But I would say that out of all these languages, I use very actively Polish, English, and Yiddish.
Okay.
I get by in the other languages. I'm refreshing my Hebrew now because it's been like once you don't if you don't use it, you lose it.
Right. It's true. But you can get it back.
Yeah, that's that.
So you've laid out a banquet, and
yes.
So I wanted to. I think there's a lot here that we can talk about. But the thing that really struck me was this moment of realization about your past, about your family's past, about your identity. Can you talk a little bit about your discovery that you were of Jewish heritage and kind of the emotions of that moment? Was it a gradual realization? Was it like a light switch? And can you cast your mind back to that time?
I often say that I believe in genetic memory because before I found out that I was Jewish, there were something was pushing me back to my roots. So I was a tour guide in the Jewish quarter of Krakow. I was studying Jewish history and culture and traditions. So there was something, And the way I found out was that I was giving tours. This was sort of late 1990s. Spielberg's Schindler's List was filmed in Krakow in 1993. And communism ended in 1989, so the borders were open. And because Schindler's List was filmed almost on location where the events happened, not exactly, but very close, it opened the door to a new kind of tourism. It was sort of like Schindler's List tours to see where the film was made because it was quite unusual. And also Krakow wasn't bombed during the Second World War, so it's still, a historic medieval town. And second, it was the time of Jewish heritage trips. Lots of people came to Poland to see where their families came from. So I was giving tours, in Krakow, and lots of people would ask me, "Oh, are you Jewish? Or which synagogue do you go to?" And I was like, "That's strange."
Yeah.
And I was talking to my parents one day, and I said, "Well, people keep asking me if I'm Jewish. That's weird." And my father said, like, "What's so strange about it? You are Jewish."
And he'd never mentioned it to you?
And I never, and I've never heard about it before. And I was like, what? I mean, I was shocked, but it was also a kind of a relief.
Okay.
Because I had a feeling that I always had the feeling that I didn't fit in, that there was that something was off, but I didn't know what it was.
Right.
And now, then looking back, I sort of saw, pieces of puzzle that I didn't connect before, and now were making sense. So to give you a few examples, when I was 13, or around the time, my grandfather told me that there is different blood in our veins. This is still under communism.
It's a very mysterious statement.
Right?
Yeah.
And of course, I thought he meant blue blood, right? We're royal.
Okay.
We're royalty, of course. And then, only then I realized that he was speaking in code, because under communism, and especially after 1968, which was the time of the last anti-Semitic campaign in Poland, where about 20,000 Jews who still lived in Poland were expelled. After that, Jewish matters became a taboo subject. Jewish life went underground. People would not tell their children about their Jewish origin. So it was really, so he was speaking to me in code, which I did not get at the time. My mom would show me a Jewish cemetery and say, like, "Oh, look, this is a Jewish cemetery." Or she would take me to a synagogue, not for services, because there were no services, but for a concert. And then my mom always said, and again, when I was 13, my mom gave me a card saying, "Education is something that nobody can take away from you." Which, first of all, getting cards was not really, quite not common. But also the statement, education is something that nobody can take away from you. You can be robbed of your possessions, but not of your education. And then I came to New York, to Columbia, to study. I started reading Jewish immigrant literature. And every second novel, as my mother said to me, education is something nobody can take away from you.
Wow.
So there was certain sort of traits that were passed down without openly talking about it. And it has been a process. I have to say, it took me a long time to say that I'm Jewish, because I thought, like, can I say that? I didn't grow up Jewish. I was able to find, according to the Jewish law, according to halacha, you have to be Jewish through the mother. And I was able to find maternal line 4 generations back, but the disconnect is pretty long, because my mother's family assimilated in the late 19th century. My father's family assimilated before the First World War, so it was sort of like
some distance, yeah.
Right. So I'm the first person in my family to speak Yiddish in 4 generations, and I'm sort of going back. I'm raising my kids Jewish, so it's been a journey. And I have to say that coming to Columbia and coming to New York was an important part of it, because I'm not religious, and sort of becoming religious was not really on the table. I learned everything, of course, and I know the prayers, and I know that, but it's not, I'm doing sort of the minimum. Like we say, I'm a high holiday Jew,
Okay.
You do that. I, do Shabbat dinner with my kids, with my family, but it's not the primary identity. My primary identity is sort of cultural identification in Yiddish, researching Yiddish, sharing my passion for Yiddish with my students at Columbia and Barnard is really sort of my life's mission and my identity journey.
So you already spoke a little bit about the Yiddish language, about how it's composed and its origin, but could you talk a little bit more, I think specifically about who speaks Yiddish today? Where is it spoken? Does it correspond with a national boundary in any way? I think a lot of people might not really know about the way in which Yiddish interacts with nation states, for example.
That's a great question. Yiddish in a nutshell. It emerged around 10th century in the Rhineland, sort of the borderland between Germany and France. It was spoken by Jews who moved from France, were moving northward, and they sort of adopted German of the neighborhood. There are some other linguistic theories now that it was not really there. It was more closer to Moravia, because what about the Slavic component? What's interesting, it was written in the Hebrew alphabet, because Jews did not know Latin alphabet. It was sort of, when you think about this time, 10th, 11th century, It was only priests who could write, and Jews prayed, and so
they had some familiarity
so they were familiar with the Hebrew alphabet.
Right.
An interesting tidbit is that Germany was called Ashkenaz in the Bible.
Okay.
So Ashkenazic became the term for this language, later on called Yiddish, but also for this entire culture that developed in Central and then later Eastern Europe. So Jews were moving eastward to escape persecution of Crusades, 11th, 12th century, moved to Poland, and Poland was the largest Jewish center until the Second World War in Europe and in the world right before the war. And while people moved to Poland, the Yiddish acquired the Slavic component. So as I said earlier, it's like 70% German, 15% Lashon Kodesh, which Hebrew Aramaic, which is the religious component, but not only, and Slavic. And it was a language without borders, without a state, without its own land. Before the Second World War, the notion appeared, people started talking about Yiddish land as this sort of concept. It's this imaginary community that exists all over the world. It's in a sense a global language where wherever Jews are, you speak Yiddish. So Europe, America, South America, Australia, Israel, like basically all over the world. This is to say that Yiddish is not the only Jewish language. There are at least like 2 or 3 dozen others, but it was most widely spoken. So before the Second World War, there were about 11 to 12 million people speaking Yiddish.
And they were mostly in Poland, what is now modern-day Poland?
Yes.
What part of Poland were they
it was all of Poland,
Okay.
But also what is referred to as Pale of Settlement. So a little tidbit of Polish history. At the end of 18th century, by 1795, Poland was partitioned by the neighboring countries, by Russia, Prussia, and Austro-Hungarian Empire, and disappeared from the map. So until 1795, there were no Jews in Russia. But once Russia acquired this whole eastern part of Poland, they suddenly got, I don't remember now, 1 million or 2 million Jews.
Okay.
And so if you were to sort of put Yiddish on today's map, it would be Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Slovakia, Czech a little bit, Hungary.
So this really is a large nation of people.
Yes. You would also include into that map Berlin. So parts of Germany, I'll talk about Germany in a moment. America. Not so much Israel before the war, but when the State of Israel was established, the first census in 1948, the first census had over 50% of people speaking Yiddish listing Yiddish as their mother tongue. Also Argentina, so it's really, it's a global community. But unfortunately, the situation changed drastically. During the Holocaust, out of 6 million Jews who were killed, over 5 million spoke Yiddish. So Yiddish took a major blow.
Yeah.
After the war, a number of things happened. The survivors who emigrated to America assimilated. They didn't speak Yiddish to their kids. When you think about it, there were still 6 million people speaking Yiddish after the war. But the perception of... There were lots of associations with Yiddish as the language of the dead, Yiddish as the language of the Holocaust. So this was one part of the post-war history. And second part of the post-war history was the State of Israel was established in 1948, and the decision that was made was that Hebrew will be established as the language of the state. There were many reasons for that, right? Because Yiddish was the language of the Ashkenazi Jews, so the Central European, Eastern European Jews. But there were Jews who spoke Ladino, the Sephardi, those who lived in Spain, and after the expulsion of Spain, lived in North Africa and Southern Europe. There are Mizrahi Jews who lived in the Middle East. So there are lots of, and the idea behind it was that if we use Yiddish as the language of the country, this will be excluding the non-Ashkenazi part of the population. But this meant that Yiddish also went down, right, in Israel, because there was at the beginning, there was a lot of tension, like people were not allowed to speak Yiddish in the streets. There was a very strong
In Israel.
In Israel,
Right.
yes. Very strong push for Hebrew. And when you think about the post-war history of Yiddish, what happened was that the secular Yiddish speakers, only small groups of people picked it up after the war. Who did pick it up after the war were the religious communities, the Hasidim, the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox. One of the challenges of the Holocaust was, how can you believe in God after the Holocaust? What
Right.
kind of God would have allowed this to happen, right?
Catastrophe.
So people would say that, the destruction of the genocide of Jewish people. So you either stopped believing in God, or you found an explanation that this was God's punishment for assimilation, for not fulfilling the commandments. And the Hasidic communities become very strongly attached to religion, to the law. And they speak Yiddish. But what's happening in the Yiddish land of today is a kind of schizophrenia, as I say to my students often, that here you have a community that speaks Yiddish in everyday life. This is a living language of, the numbers are different, like somewhere between a million and a half of the Hasidic community. But because they are so religious, they will not read Isaac Bashevis Singer. They will not read Shalom Aleichem. They will not engage at all with the secular literature, with modern Yiddish literature and culture, which is a kind of a sort of dissonance, right? Like, how do you deal with that? And here you have a community of so-called Yiddishists, so people who do speak Yiddish, but not so much for communication purposes. Professor Jeffrey Chandler wrote a fascinating book, which I highly recommend, Adventures in Yiddish Land, in which he makes an argument that Yiddish has become sort of a post-vernacular. That speaking Yiddish is a kind of a statement, a political statement, that you're speaking Yiddish to prove something, but not necessarily to communicate. This is not the primary purpose. And he said that Yiddish speakers, that he heard repeatedly, that Yiddish speakers are made in the bedroom and not in the classroom. And he said, well, not now Yiddish speakers are also made in the classroom, not only in the bedroom.
Right.
And, so the prognosis for Yiddish was treated as the endangered language on the UNESCO list. And now the prognoses are that because Hasidic community has such a high birth rate,
Right.
that by 2075 there will be like several more million of speakers. So it won't be an endangered language at all. But so this is the situation today. The numbers, it's very hard to say how many people speak Yiddish today, because how do you count, right? Whatever census there is, Yiddish speakers always speak other languages.
Right.
So they may not necessarily list the Yiddish as their primary language. So the estimates are somewhere between 700,000 to 3 million. You can't really know. Although the number of Hasidic speakers is growing, and I always say to my students, after the first day when they learn how to say Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem Shalom, wie heißt du, ich heiß Agi, von wannen kommst du, ich komm von Kroake, Polen, und so weiter, that they are joining the community of Yiddish speakers. Sure. But there is still this disconnect in the sort of contemporary Yiddish land in terms of the community that uses it as an everyday life and the community of students, of the speakers who are made in the classroom.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I think there is, in comparison to 10, 15 years ago, there is more of an overlap between these two. We, for instance, had at Columbia some years ago a Hasidic student who is called Lipa Schmelzer, who is a rock star in the Hasidic community. He's referred to as the Hasidic Lady Gaga.
Okay.
He's a singer, very, very famous, and so he was sort of a star here. But his dream, and in the context of contemporary Hasidic community, there is not that much interaction with the outside world. So the fact that he came to study at Columbia was already rebellious. And his dream was to sort of build a bridge between these two communities, right? He's like, I want to read Shalom Aleichem. I want to read the great writers and sort of expand my language, because my language is mostly sort of everyday.
Right.
He also writes his songs, his poetry.
It's really interesting to me that that you have students studying Yiddish in New York City, which is really a center historically and even today of the Yiddish language. And you mentioned that coming to New York and living in New York was an important milestone or step in your understanding of your own identity as a Yiddish speaker. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that is and what you discovered about Yiddish in New York City.
There were like two parallel tracks. One was that when I came here, I sort of was embraced by my what I call extended Jewish family. So friends that I met in Poland and who basically adopted me when I came. So this was part of this very strong, it was part of my identity journey, sort of, right? This was the first time I have now what I call my chosen sister, a friend whom I met on the tour in Poland, whose father survived the Krakow ghetto, and who came with her mother and her son and niece to sort of explore the roots. And I was lucky to be their tour guide, and we talked, and and I said, like, oh, I'm coming to New York next month. I've never been to the States. I don't know anyone. I'm a little terrified. And Michelle said, oh, come to us for Rosh Hashanah, for the Jewish New Year. And there's this concert in 92nd Street. Why? So I said, thank you, but I didn't expect a follow. People say things. Yeah. I didn't expect a follow-up. And then I came over, and it's like, okay, what time are you coming? She calls me, and it's like, what time are you coming? And 18 years later, we're very, very close friends. So this was one part of the journey. But second part of the journey was that I actually could speak Yiddish with people. Because in Poland, I learned how to speak Yiddish through a Lauder Foundation and then the university. But it was only in the academic context. Right. And I could read and understand much faster than I could speak. I mean, I could speak, the basics, but sort of not. And here when I came, I could actually speak with living people. So it was a mind-blowing experience. And not only I was able to engage with the Yiddishist, the secular Yiddishist community, which was fascinating, to go. There are a number of, that's why I was saying that New York is really the best place to study Yiddish, because there are lots of reading circles, Lehnkreisen, Schmueskreisen, like speaking circles. So there are people who meet on a regular basis to speak Yiddish, to read Yiddish. So I'm still part of a group, not as frequently as I would like to, Lehnkreis with Professor David Fishman from JTS. So it used to be at his house, like every couple of weeks. We meet as a group and we read various texts. Now with post-pandemic, it's all on Zoom, so the communities. But lots of things like that are happening. So you just need to open your eyes and ears, and you can join and can actually engage with Yiddish. And another thing is that there are a number of families, Yiddishist families, who are New York-based, who decided to raise their kids in Yiddish and speak Yiddish with them. So for me also, and I used to bring some of the members of the Schechter dynasty in inverted commas, like a family that's been very, very deeply involved in Yiddish in post-war America. The grandchildren of Mordecai Schechter, who was a very famous Yiddish linguist. He was actually a lecturer of Yiddish at Columbia. So to bring his kids to class who were then in their early 20s, and for my students to see their peers speaking fluent Yiddish was like, wow, what's happening? So really, New York is the place for Yiddish.
You've integrated into the contemporary Yiddish community of New York City, this community of scholars, Yiddish scholars in New York. But New York City also has a long history of Yiddish theater, Yiddish communities. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because I know you're doing a project that is about mapping these communities. So just, can you lay out the landscape a little bit of that?
Of course, with pleasure. New York has a very rich Yiddish history that started sort of around 1880s with this massive immigration from Europe. And between 1880s and 1924, when the Immigration Act was introduced, it is estimated that about 2 to 3 million Jews, Yiddish-speaking Jews, came over to to America, but New York was the landing point. Sometimes they moved on somewhere else, but mostly stayed here. And Lower East Side, which was sort of the concentration of the Yiddish-speaking world, was around the time sort of the most densely populated place in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And Hester Street in particular was very densely inhabited. So people came here around the time New York and Lower East Side in particular became the flourishing center of Yiddish culture. It was also the time of transition. So people, there are lots of stories about people landing on Ellis Island and sort of getting rid of all the religious garb and starting a new life. You're leaving all this behind. But the transition from religious life to completely non-religious life was hard. So Yiddish theater became a kind of a substitute for a synagogue, one might say. So Yiddish theater district and Second Avenue flourished throughout 1920s and 30s, starting in late 19th century. And there were over 500 synagogues in the area. So this is really an incredibly rich history. I mean, it all, of course, changed right with the war and then post-war. So people would move into, as they were sort of climbing up socially, they moved to other neighborhoods. And after the war, there was this tendency in America, like you are in America, you're American, you speak English, right?
Across the board.
Across the board. So this was a blow to Yiddish after the war. And I have been really drawn to digital humanities. I'm absolutely fascinated by the opportunities and possibilities that it offers. And when I came to Columbia, I sort of inherited a project that was called Mapping Yiddish Theater that was started by my predecessor. And I was excited about this, but the theater is not my main specialty. And I didn't want to take over something that wasn't really mine. So I transformed it into Mapping Yiddish New York. So what we're doing is we're mapping Yiddish New York, creating an online archive documenting Yiddish cultural history of the city. So it's a combination of Google Maps and WordPress blog. And the idea is that students create their own entries. This is publicly available. So this has been a really good point where many students said that, oh, this is fascinating. Like, we're writing something, we're contributing to the online archive, we're contributing to public knowledge. It's not only for my eyes, the essay that you're writing, but it's out there and people can read it. Yeah. So in language classes, I'm asking people to translate smaller pieces like a theater poster or some headlines, like something manageable. And in literature classes or more advanced language classes, people create posts depending on the subject. So this was one part. Then I taught a class on American Jewish women writers who spoke Yiddish. We mapped the theaters. We mapped some iconic restaurants or places of interest. So it's a growing archive. And I'm very proud of the students' achievements on that site and see how this sort of allows them to engage with authentic materials in a meaningful way. And the sense of it teaches them archival skills. It teaches them skills of digital publishing, which is the new reality of today's job market anyway. Sure. And it also allows them to, and it's very meaningful to them that they can contribute to sort of the online archive of knowledge. So this is really fascinating.
So are there some, I've seen some posters. I've been on this website and seen a few posters, and I had the impression that some plays were performed in different languages, but the same play and the same actors. So there would be a version in Yiddish, and then there would be a version in another language. Is that right, or am I?
By another language, you mean English?
Like English, yeah.
So often the posters would be bilingual,
okay,
but the play would be in English, in Yiddish.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
okay, I got you.
The play would be,
yeah.
And this is also part of again of the assimilation process. Like even in the 20s and 30s, the kids of the immigrants, they would still understand, but they would want English title on the poster.
So they would see the play and say, okay, I can go there and I can understand it, even though I might not actively speak Yiddish.
Yes. So they would be like, classic heritage speakers, right? Who can understand but speak back in English.
Cool. Yeah. And I know there was in the Catskills region. This was a resort area for Jewish people in the mid-century, and Yiddish was being spoken there as well. Do you investigate that dynamic as well, or is that sort of outside of?
That's a great question. Not so much. Yeah, there was so-called Borscht Belt, right? So this was like a favorite vacation spot of New York Jews because it's not far away, and we don't investigate it that much. But that's a great idea. And I have to say, I'm glad that you brought it up because I just finished another project that's associated with Yiddish at Columbia, Naomi Fellowship, which is a sort of Yiddish study abroad program at Columbia. As we mentioned earlier, there is no country where students can go and speak Yiddish the whole time. So we tried to create a program that will be sort of the closest to the Yiddish study abroad experience. So part of it is a study trip called Exploring Yiddishland, which usually takes place in Poland. So we go to Poland. I go to Poland with the students. We have up to 6 spots every year, and it's sort of a faculty-led study trip to the original Yiddishland, as I call it. And the focus of the trip is Yiddish before the war and Yiddish now, because Poland is one of the strongest sort of Yiddish study centers right now. And then students go to Israel for an intensive Yiddish summer program for 4 weeks. So this is sort of the closer that we have. And this year, because of the situation in Europe with the war in Ukraine, we didn't go to Poland, but we did the Exploring Yiddishland component in New York and the vicinity. And this is where the Catskills come in.
Okay, yeah.
So we spent 5 days in the city looking at archives, because there are fantastic archival materials in Yiddish at YIVA, which is now based in New York on West 16th in New York Public Library, and at our very own Columbia libraries as well. We had a number of workshops, Yiddish song workshops and acting workshops with actors from the Yiddish theater. We had Yiddish literature workshops. So it's been like exploring all shades of Yiddishland. We also went to Borough Park to see the ultra-Orthodox community and explore this culture as well. And towards the end, we drove to Amherst, Massachusetts, to Yiddish Book Center, which is another fascinating institution that started 40 or so years ago with Aaron Lansky, who was a graduate student at Harvard, and he realized that there are no Yiddish books to read. And he set out on a venture to start collecting Yiddish books. And he thought like, well, we'll have a few hundred, maybe a few thousand. And now, 40 years later, there are 1.5 million or more. And so many of them have been digitized. So it's a fascinating place to visit. And from there, we drove to Yiddish Farm in Goshen, New York, which is Catskills area, which is not the Borscht Belt, but it's a very interesting and unique place. It's a Yiddish farm where only Yiddish is spoken. It's an actual farm.
Yeah.
It's a family that runs it. The kids speak Yiddish. So we just finished the program, and I'm still, energized and uplifted from it, because it was really a fantastic exploration of various aspects of contemporary Yiddish land in New York.
And what was the name of the fellowship again? Can you?
Naomi Fellowship.
And it's for Columbia students, or who's it open to?
So it's for Columbia and Barnard students who commit to 3 semesters of Yiddish at Columbia. And several of the former Naomi Fellows went on to major in Yiddish. And 2 of the former Naomi Fellows and Yiddish majors were hired by YIVA.
Oh, nice.
So it's like, well, you would think that this is, humanities are sort of struggling as a field, and here you have 2 students who, after being at Columbia and participating in the programs, will now have Yiddish in their lives.
Yeah,
so this is very exciting.
Yeah. This is the end of part 1. In part 2, Agi will talk about Isaac Bashevis-Singer, an author who wrote in both Yiddish and English and who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1978. We'll also discuss her research on the motif of the Dybbuk, which is a possessing spirit from the Jewish tradition. Stay tuned for the next episode of Said and Done, coming on July 21st, 2022.